The Black Archive.
They had already surrendered. That was the detail that would stay with the survivors long after the war ended. Not the cold, not the sound of gunfire, not even the chaos of battle, but that single moment when they believed it was over. It was December 17th, 1944, deep in the Ardennes region of Belgium, during what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Just one day earlier, German forces had launched a massive surprise offensive, breaking through American lines in an attempt to split Allied forces and push toward Antwerp. The attack had come through dense forest in winter conditions, at a time when many believed the enemy no longer had the strength for such an operation. But they were wrong. The offensive hit fast, hard, and without warning. Roads became choke points. Units became isolated. Communication broke down. In many areas, American troops found themselves facing armored columns they hadn't expected to see, moving with speed and coordination that turned confusion into collapse. Among those caught in the path of the advance were elements of American artillery and support, units near a small crossroads outside the town of Malmedy. They were not prepared for what was coming. They had not expected to be on the front line. And when German armored units appeared, supported by infantry and advancing aggressively, resistance quickly became impossible, outnumbered and exposed. The Americans did what soldiers are trained to do when the situation becomes untenable. They surrendered. Weapons were dropped. Hands were raised. Voices called out. There was no resistance left, only the expectation that the rules of war would now apply, that they would be disarmed, processed, and sent to the rear as prisoners. For a brief moment, everything slowed. The noise of battle faded. The tension eased. Some of the men even allowed themselves to breathe differently, as if a weight had been lifted from their chest. Survival in that instant seemed certain. They were gathered into an open field. Snow covered the ground, thin but cold. The sky was grey, heavy with winter. Around them stood German soldiers, part of a fast-moving armored unit pushing deeper into Allied territory. The Germans appeared focused, hurried, driven by something beyond the immediate moment. Their mission demanded speed, momentum. They were not there to stop. They were there to break through. The American prisoners stood close together, dozens of them waiting. Some spoke quietly. Others remained silent, staring ahead. A few glanced around, trying to read the situation, to understand what would happen next. There was tension, but also a strange sense of calm. They had survived the battle. That meant something. Then something shifted. It wasn't obvious at first. There was no clear signal, no shouted command that everyone could hear. But there was a change in posture, a movement, a tightening in the air that some would later remember without being able to explain. And then gunfire, sudden, sharp, close. At first, it didn't make sense. A few men looked around, confused, trying to understand where the shots were coming from. Some thought it was an accident. Others assumed it was a misunderstanding, a reaction to something unseen. But the firing didn't stop. Men began to fall. The realization came quickly, but not quickly enough. This was not confusion. This was intentional. Panic spread through the group. Some dropped instantly, throwing themselves to the ground, hoping instinctively that stillness might protect them. Others turned and ran, sprinting across the open field. Despite knowing there was nowhere to go, the snow offered no cover. The distance offered no safety. Gunfire followed them. One survivor would later describe the sound as overwhelming, not just loud but constant, echoing across the frozen ground in a way that made it impossible to think clearly. There was shouting, movement, and then the kind of chaos that has no structure, no direction, only reaction. Within moments, the field changed. What had been a group of prisoners became something else entirely. Stillness returned slowly. The firing stopped. The cold wind moved again across the open ground, carrying with it the silence that follows sudden violence. Bodies lay where they had fallen, scattered across the snow, motionless. But not all of them were dead. Some had survived by instinct alone. They lay among the others, completely still, controlling their breathing, forcing their bodies not to react. Every movement felt dangerous. Every sound felt amplified. The fear of being noticed was stronger than anything else. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time, in moments like that, doesn't behave normally. Some of the German soldiers moved through the field, watching, observing. For the men on the ground, those footsteps became the only thing that mattered. The distance between life and death reduced to whether or not they were seen. A slight movement, a breath too deep, a sound at the wrong moment. Eventually, the German unit moved on. The offensive did not pause. The column continued forward, driven by its objective, leaving the field behind as it had found it, only changed in ways that could not be undone. The survivors waited. Even after the area seemed clear, they did not move immediately. Fear held them in place. The uncertainty of whether it was truly over kept them still. But eventually, slowly, one by one, they began to move, crawling first, testing the moment, then rising carefully, looking around, trying to understand what had just happened. Some were injured, others were in shock. All of them were changed. They had to get out. The cold made everything harder. The snow, the terrain, the pain, it all worked against them. Some could barely walk. Others helped where they could. There was no coordination, no plan, only the shared understanding that staying was not an option. They moved toward Allied lines. Every step carried risk. The front was unstable. German units were still advancing. Confusion still dominated the region. But eventually, after what must have felt like an endless journey, they reached safety, and they told their story. At first, it was difficult for others to fully understand, not because it was unclear, but because it challenged expectations. The idea that soldiers who had surrendered could be killed in such a way did not fit the structure many still believed governed the war. But the survivors were consistent. Their accounts aligned. And soon, the truth could not be ignored. The event became known as the Malmedy Massacre. Investigators would later reach the site. What they found confirmed everything. The bodies remained where they had fallen, preserved by the cold. The field itself became evidence, silent but undeniable. The number of dead would be recorded, the details documented, but numbers do not capture what moments like that mean. For the soldiers who survived, the memory did not fade. Not with time, not with distance. It remained, tied not only to what they saw, but to what they felt, the moment when surrender did not bring safety, when expectation gave way to something else entirely. Among American forces, the reaction was immediate. News spread quickly through units across the Ardennes. The story carried weight, not just as information, but as something personal. It changed how soldiers viewed the conflict unfolding around them. It altered perception, hardened attitudes. War, already brutal, felt different, more unpredictable, more dangerous in ways that extended beyond the battlefield. The offensive itself continued. Fighting intensified, conditions worsened. The Ardennes became a place of constant pressure, where movement was difficult, visibility limited, and every engagement carried uncertainty. But the memory of Malmedy remained. It became part of the broader understanding of what was happening in those forests. In that winter, during those critical days, after the war, investigations continued, trials were held, testimonies given, decisions examined, responsibility assigned. The event was analyzed from multiple angles. Military, legal, historical questions were asked. Why did it happen? Was it a breakdown of command? A consequence of urgency and pressure? Or something more deliberate? The answers, like many things in war, were complex, but the outcome was clear. The Malmedy Massacre became one of the most well-known incidents involving the killing of prisoners during World War II in Europe. It stood as a reminder that even within structured conflict, moments can occur where the expected boundaries collapse. For historians, it became a case study, for soldiers a warning, for survivors a memory that never left. Years later, when the war had long ended and the world had changed, those who lived through that day would still return to it in their minds. Not because they wanted to, but because some experiences do not fade. They remain, not as constant pain, but as something quieter, persistent. The cold field, the grey sky. The moment everything shifted, the realization that even when the fighting stops, danger doesn't always end, and that sometimes, in war, the most terrifying moments are not those faced in battle, but those that come after the decision to stop. Fighting has already been made. That was Malmedy, not just a place, but a moment when expectation and reality collided and everything changed.